Right, sports fans, how's everybody out there doing? William Martin coming at you one more time here on YouTube with another edition of the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge Podcast. Last week saw legendary Minnesota Vikings defensive end Jim Marshall pass away at the age of 87. Now, Marshall played 20 years in the National Football League, with 19 of them coming with the Vikings. And during Marshall's time with the Vikings, he was a member of Minnesota's famed defensive line known as the Purple People Eaters. And those People Eaters were a big reason why the Vikings played in four Super Bowls during the decade of the 1970s. Marshall finished his NFL career with 130 and a half career sacks. And of course, during Marshall's time in the NFL, the sack was not an official stat as that didn't come into play until 1982. But Marshall's 130 and a half career sacks are tied for 22nd place with Coy Bacon on the NFL's all time unofficial sack list. Now, Marshall also set a record during his playing career: 270 consecutive games played, which is a record that stood for nearly 3 decades before it was broken by punter Jeff Fiegels and then, of course, quarterback Brett Favre. And when you take this into context, Marshall's record was set in an era where there was much more physicality in the National Football League. Players didn't have certain amenities. They really, I think at that point, maybe towards the late end of Marshall's NFL career, there were a couple of indoor stadiums, but nonetheless, you think about those games that the Vikings played in Bloomington at Metropolitan Stadium. You also think about, just everything about the NFL, everything about the way of life. And this man played in 270 consecutive games. Okay, you have to really take that into accountability, along with the fact of the position that he played. And I think something like that alone should have been recognized by the Pro Football Hall of Fame a long time ago. But unfortunately, I've talked about this before. There's favoritism when it comes to the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and sometimes people hold things against players. And of course, some people might still hold the wrong way touchdown against Jim Marshall in 1964, the four Viking Super Bowl losses during the 1970s, and also the fact that Marshall played on a D line with both Carl Eller and Alan Page, who are both in Canton right now. But even if people want to use all of that against Jim Marshall, the bottom line is it absolutely stinks. If you watch it, like, to me, I think the Hall of Fame is all about being one of the better players and being one of the better players of your era. And Jim Marshall, in my opinion, was that. He's been denied entry to Canton for far too long. And I'm not just saying this because the man passed away recently, because I have talked about it before, but I'm here to highlight it once again after his passing. And too many legendary players, too many people who have made impacts to the game of football have been looked over for far too long. They've passed away and they haven't gotten their proper due. I talked about L.C. Greenwood multiple times, a famed member of that steel curtain defense for the Pittsburgh Steelers for the 1970s. You think about Dan Reeves as a head coach. Dan Reeves won 190 games during the regular season in the NFL, which is 10th all time. Okay. And he and Marty Schottenheimer are the only head coaches in the top 10 that are eligible for the Hall of Fame that have not been inducted. Bill Belichick is on that list, as well as Andy Reid. And of course, you know that their days are going to come sooner rather than later. But you think about it: Dan Reeves, 190 career wins. He took three teams to the playoffs, won a playoff game with three different teams, took two teams to the Super Bowl. And, I know that he never got that championship, but you think about it. Dan Reeves went 0-4 in the Super Bowl. So did Mark Levy, and so did Bud Grant. They're in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Okay. I talked about Marty Schottenheimer, 200 career wins. Okay. Everybody else, like I said, in the top 10 is in the Hall of Fame. Don Shula, George Halas, Tom Landry, Curly Lambeau, Paul Brown, Chuck Noll. And it's unfortunately for Schottenheimer, his playoff record is used against him, 5-13. But you think about what he did to revitalize the Cleveland Browns in the 1980s, did it with the Kansas City Chiefs in the 1990s. Old school football fans will know where I'm coming from on this. Think back to the Chiefs of the 70s and 80s. Arrowhead Stadium was a graveyard until Marty Schottenheimer got there. You also think about, his stint with the San Diego Chargers and what he did for them. But of course, unfortunately, Marty Schottenheimer passed away, and he never got to see his proper due in Canton. Don Coryell, another head coach, and I know that he doesn't have the wins that Dan Reeves or Marty Schottenheimer might have, but guess what? Air Coryell is still you're still seeing like its impact on the game of football from an offensive standpoint in this day and age. He was way ahead of his time for that. You think about some of the assistant coaches that worked for him that went on to have success in the NFL, Joe Gibbs, and of course, John Madden and Dick Vermeil, who himself is a Hall of Fame head coach. Dick Vermeil said when his St. Louis Rams won the Super Bowl in 1999, they used Don Coryell's Air Coryell offense. You go back and look at Air Coryell in the 70s and 80s with the Chargers. Look at the Rams offense from that era. It was basically the same thing. Steve Smith Sr., another player, phenomenal wide receiver. He's been passed over because of the quote unquote logjam at the wide receiver position. But again, you go back and look at Steve Smith's stats for all of those years with the Carolina Panthers and then with the Baltimore Ravens. Was he or was he not one of the better players of his era? I can go right down the list. I'm just using these guys as an example, but unfortunately, it is a popularity contest when it comes to the Pro Football Hall of Fame in regards to certain people, and it sucks. There's no other way to say it. Okay, sometimes we see the quarterbacks get a free pass. Sometimes we see team owners and some coaches get a free pass while everybody else is made to jump through hoops. And unfortunately for Jim Marshall, he left this earth and he never got his proper billing, which is to get into the Hall of Fame. So hopefully sooner rather than later, the folks in Canton, the folks on that committee do right. Put a guy like Jim Marshall in there who's been long deserving of it. Put so many countless others and stop making the Pro Football Hall of Fame a popularity contest. But, folks, that is going to wrap it up. And as always, I want to take this time out to thank each and every one of you for checking out the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. And if you like what you heard and saw on this podcast, you know what to do. Please feel free to hit that like button as well as subscribing to this channel. Like I always say, it's greatly appreciated. Also, if you're on the X, formerly known as Twitter, please feel free to follow me at 300 Pounds of Sports. And like I always say, if you give me that follow, I'll give you that follow right back. Same goes for Instagram, where you can check me out at 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge. Also, if you're on Facebook, you can check us out at the Sports Depot 365. And as far as I'm concerned, one of the better sports debating sites going on social media. But until next time, fine folks, my name is William Martin. I am signing off, and I'm saying thanks once again for tuning into the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. Be well, everybody.